Oh. All right. Well, welcome to the Wayside Women's Wellness Echo. Um, I'm going to share just a little bit about Wayside Women's Wellness Echo and Project Echo. So first off, a little bit of information about Wayside Recovery Center. So I work for Wayside Recovery Center, and this is kind of half of the Echo part here. And we are a recovery center in Minnesota. We provide mental health and addiction treatment services for women, children, and families. Project Echo, which is the other half of this, the Echo part stands for Extension for Community Healthcare Outcomes, is a movement to demonopolize knowledge and amplify the capacity to provide best practice care. So together, we have the Wayside Women's Wellness Echo. It's 1 hour long at noon each month. I know an hour sometimes sounds like a short period of time, but it's really meant to be kind of a lunch and learn style series, really planting the seed and sharing practice and support service information, which will hopefully enable participating organizations to really empower all people in recovery and empower women and families to break the cycle of addiction and trauma. So today, our session is entitled The Silent Killer, Understanding Stigma in Substance Use Disorder Care. This is part 2 of 3. And our speaker for the day is Lydia Barthalo, who may look familiar to some of you. If you were here for our last Wayside Women's Wellness Echo, Lydia was actually our speaker for part 1 of this series and will continue to be our speaker as well for the next Echo. So I know some of you might just be hopping in today. Maybe you missed the last Echo session, which I think is fine, but I'm just going to share a little bit about Lydia, give you some background about her, and then I'll pass things over. So Lydia is a doctorally prepared psychiatric nurse practitioner with a specialty in addiction medicine and trauma-informed care. She currently staffs and directs a trauma-informed urgent substance withdrawal management center and is on the faculty at UCSF, where she teaches in the psychiatric nurse practitioner program. She speaks nationally on topics such as co-occurring disorders, harm reduction, and substance use disorder care, system improvement, and she focuses all parts of her practice on radical public health, harm reduction, and anti-oppression work. So without further ado, welcome again, Lydia, and I will pass things over to you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Zora. I love that you guys offer this. I think it's so great that you guys offer this ongoing education. And I'm so happy that I get to be with you guys for a couple of the sessions. Also, full disclaimer, I'm a little bit of a mess right now. I was kind of a mess last time I was here too. I just started a new medical director job and I just can't get other things to fall in place the way that I want them to. So my slides for today aren't updated to where I thought they were. So it's going to be a little bit tricky. Bear with me, you guys. Before we jump into slides, let me tell you a little bit about me. Zora, thank you so much for the introduction. That was really lovely. Key things to know about me are that I have a doctorate, but I very much always identify as sort of a nurse first. So, especially when I'm thinking about trauma-informed care, I'm really coming from a nursing perspective because nursing has always been really interested in the patient experience. Medicine tends to be pretty interested in outcomes, and nursing feels like experience and outcomes are just as important. So I saw a bunch of nurses as I logged on this morning, and I was super excited about that. Go nurses. Excited to be here with all the nurses in the room. The other thing that I always want to highlight is that I'm a person in long-term recovery. So I do a lot of academic work about trauma-informed care. I do clinical work. I do some administrative work. But through all of that, I'm coming as a person in long-term recovery. I consider my specialties to be trauma-informed care and harm reduction. And part of the joy of my life is really like understanding and seeing how traditional recovery movements and harm reduction can fit together and actually have very similar goals. So I'm excited to be with you guys today to talk about trauma-informed care because I think that brings all of this together. And we started, Zora, you can advance the slides through my introduction and go a little bit. That's a perfect place to hang out for a second. We started last time I was here talking about stigma. And it'll be hard for me to see, but I would love for you guys to put in the chat how many of you were here for that stigma talk? And if you remember, can you put in the chat why we talk about stigma first? And I say it'll be hard for me to see because there's been something wrong with my Zoom recently where whenever someone enters into the chat, it takes me back to the beginning. So I just sit here and scroll down every time.
And I can help you out too, Lydia, if you need to with the chat.
Thanks.
Christina said clients are not getting the care that they need due to stigma. And then we have
Yeah, absolutely. So it looks like a couple. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Zora.
Oh, just a couple yeses. I was here. A few no, I was not.
Great. Okay. So, yep, I'm seeing those. Oh, and someone said we have to recognize our own bias first in order to set aside to be person-centered. And Rochelle, hopefully I'm pronouncing your name correctly. I love that you say that because I always start in talking about trauma-informed care. I always start with stigma first, and here's why. Lots of organizations hire me to help them implement trauma-informed care into their substance use disorder settings, whether it be residential or withdrawal management or outpatient. People hire me to come help them be more trauma-informed. And what I found is that I would go and I would talk about trauma-informed care and people would be really excited about it. And then I'd go back in like 6 months to see how things were going and people weren't doing it, which is just part of, if you send someone in once and you just get like a one-time training, it's often not super useful. But what I really uncovered over doing this for several years is that oftentimes stigma and these sort of untold or unstated narratives we have about people with substance use disorders is what gets in the way of providing truly trauma-informed services. So we've got all these like preconceived notions about what people with substance use disorders are like and sort of what it takes to quote unquote get clean. We've got all these like stories we've been telling culturally, and those have often sort of jumped into our brains whether we like it or not. And then they influence the care we provide, and they get in the way of providing evidence-based care, and they get in the way of providing really patient-centered care. And so I always start with stigma because we got to sort of address the elephant in the room if we want to transform the way that our substance use disorder services look and the way that they feel for our clients. And does anyone that was there want to recap real quick some of the like key takeaways from the stigma talk? And Zora, you can advance. And whether you were here or not, you could just get the answer from this slide.
And also you can feel free to unmute too if you feel more comfortable just saying whatever versus writing it in the chat.
This slide is horribly formatted. I'm really sorry, you guys. I actually took this one out for you today, I thought, but clearly I didn't save that slide deck.
So last week you had said stigmatization is the strongest predictor of substance use disorder, and that anti-stigmatization, prevention, and outreach programs are needed to overcome the reluctance of this clientele to use healthcare services.
Holy smokes. Did you write that down? That's amazing. That was so like academic sounding and on point. That was awesome. I love it. Yeah. So kind of key thing about reviewing stigma, first of all, it's what gets in the way of providing trauma-informed care, but stigma is also just something we should all be talking about in SUDS treatment, because there was this huge meta-analysis back in 2014, which is getting old at this point. There's this big meta-analysis, and it said that stigma was the number one reason that people didn't get into recovery services. And by the way, when I say recovery services, I mean anything that's about a positive behavior change. When I say recovery services, I mean needle exchange, I mean withdrawal management, I mean outpatient care. I mean anything that is about behavior change where people are sort of taking either big or small bites to improve their life and get onto a recovery journey. And what the meta-analysis said is that stigma was the number one reason that people didn't engage, essentially, because healthcare providers didn't treat them well. And healthcare could be substance use disorder and addiction services. It could be the emergency room. It could be primary care. That was sort of a big umbrella term. And so addressing stigma and the way we sort of these untold stories really become central just in providing good care overall, and then especially in providing trauma-informed care. And Zora, you can advance a slide. Does anybody, oh, one more or maybe a couple more? Here we are. Does anybody remember sort of the 3 types of stigma that we should always be thinking about and cognizant of? And this is, again, if you don't remember, you weren't there, it's on the slide for you.
Looks like somebody raised their hand. If you want to.
Oh, Alicia?
Alicia.
Yeah, so I wasn't in the last class, but when it comes down to the different layers or types of stigma, from my understanding, personal stigma is like how an individual feels about themselves in regard to, the substance use disorder, alcohol use disorder, maybe even mental health, whatever, right?
Yep, you got it. Absolutely.
Okay.
So,
All right, cool.
yep. So we've got kind of 3 main layers of stigma that we always want to be thinking about. The first one is structural. And this one always sounds really like big and overwhelming, and I'll try to break it down for you. When I say structural, I'm not talking about buildings. I'm talking about big invisible systems that get in the way of recovery services. I'm talking about things like lack of access to care, funding streams being diverted. I'm talking about things like you go to the ER and they have this amazing policy and procedure for how to respond rapidly and humanely to a heart attack. But if you go to the ER for an opioid overdose, and let's say this was 5 years ago, they don't really know what to do. They send you out the door and they say, stop using drugs. So that's an example of structural stigma. It's these big sort of invisible structures that impact how much attention and value we place on tending to people that have substance use disorders and treating substance use disorders as a medical illness. Structural absolutely influences interpersonal, and interpersonal shows up a lot in healthcare. And that's where we treat people differently because they have a substance use disorder. That's where we dehumanize people or become judgmental and carry a lot of bias because someone has a substance use disorder. And then interpersonal, and I'm going kind of quickly because this is what we spent a lot of time on last time. Interpersonal is it really influential in personal stigma, which, as Alicia said, personal stigma is then the way that we feel about ourselves as a person with a substance use disorder. Personal stigma is where we carry these self stories of like, God, I'm such a piece of shit and I can't ever recover. And who would ever want to love or tend to someone that has done the things that I have done while I'm actively using? And Nora Volkov, who's the head of the NIH Addiction Center, she says personal stigma is one of like the biggest barriers, which I really agree with. And she has this amazing sort of framework on the neurobiology of shame. So it's basically the neurobiology of personal stigma and how the neurobiology of feeling so crappy about yourself and sort of being flooded with shame, which makes us have high cortisol, actually prohibits us from being able to engage in recovery services. And it's really powerful. So each of those three layers sort of interplays and intersects with the others and really prevents people from getting into recovery services. Oh, sorry. Claire said, is it Laura Volkov? It's Nora, Nora. And I think you got her last name correct, Nora Volkov. And yeah, I'm happy to send out the name of that paper. It was in the New England Journal of Medicine. And you can probably just look up Nora Volkov, New England Journal of Medicine. I want to say it was 2019 or 2020. And she just has this really beautiful way of talking about how much personal stigma impacts people getting into recovery, which is why things like We Do Recover, these sort of media campaigns of We Do Recover have been so meaningful and so influential. And that's why we've put a lot of sort of effort and energy into those. And trauma-informed care seeks to sort of tend to each of these, which we'll come back to in a second. All right, next slide, Zora. One thing that we talked about really quickly last time was language. So something that's really actionable is we know that there are certain words that decrease stigma and then words that propel stigma. And I won't spend a lot of time on this today, but there's actually evidence-based language around what words can harm and what words can help. And I always show this graphic, which you're welcome to come back to and look out more. But I always show this graphic because the primary researcher here was this guy, Robert Ashford. And I love him. He's a social worker and he's in recovery. And anytime that we can elevate the voices of people in recovery, I'm going to do it. So he's pretty out about being in recovery. And I also like this because he's really clear. He and the team are really clear. It's not like this word is bad or this word is good. It's in this setting, this is going to create more stigma. And it's really based on some high quality evidence. So he's not policing language. And we talked about this at length. When we talk about language as being a tool to decrease stigma, it's not about policing language. Like a client comes in and is like, "Dude, Lydia, I relapsed over the weekend." I'm not going to be like, well, technically, I think what you mean is return to use or recurrence of use. I'm not even going to do that to my coworkers when they say relapse or medication assisted treatment. The idea here is to think differently for ourselves and use different language and model it. And when we're charting in a medical setting, and I don't know how many of you are charting in a medical setting, but when you're charting in a medical setting, that's the time where I tend to be a little bit more rigid about it. So like my staff, when they chart, I want to make sure that they have evidence-based language. And so again, I really like this particular graphic because it's really clear in a medical setting, here's the language you should use from an evidence-based standpoint. But like if you go to a mutual aid meeting, dude, people get to tell their story. People get to self-narrate in whatever way feels best to them. All right, next slide. Another language slide. We can go again. Go forward. Great. Okay, so now we're going to sort of pivot to talking about the neurobiology of trauma and how it makes us more vulnerable to developing addiction. So this series is a 3-part series, and the first one is really all about stigma because we have to address stigma in order to become more trauma informed. And this second one is all about how trauma and substance use disorders are connected. So we're going to spend maybe the next 20 minutes, maybe 25 minutes talking about the neurobiology of trauma and how that makes us more likely to develop a substance use disorder. And I like to get into this a little bit more deeply, and it's not super deep. Like, I also teach a class on this for 8 hours, so 1 hour or 25 minutes is not super deep, but I like to get into it a little bit because I think if you wanna be really trauma informed, it helps us to really understand how it is that experiencing adversity and chaos in childhood and even into adulthood makes us really vulnerable to developing a substance use disorder. And I guess I'm so curious when I say that, when I say like, "Hey, we have to understand how trauma begets substance use disorders, to become more trauma informed," why do you guys think that is? Why is it so important for us to understand the why in order to do the thing? My least favorite thing about Zoom is the lag. Like, I bet you someone has put something in the chat and I can't see it yet. Nothing?
If I may be truly honest with you, I was trying to like copy down the slide and I did not hear the question asked at all. And that was totally on my part.
No worries. Thank you for the transparency. I just see that Angela just popped in and said the intervention has to be informed by the why. You can't apply random solutions. And Angela, I think that's so well said. The intervention has to be informed by the why. And here's how I think about that. If we want to replace these kind of cultural narratives we have about who people are with substance use disorders and what recovery is like and how we should treat them, if we want to replace those narratives, we can't just take that narrative away and say that's not right. We have to put in another story. You can't just remove something and not put something in its place. So, if we want to be more trauma informed, we have to retell the story of who people are that develop substance use disorders and why they develop those substance use disorders. We have culturally, and I'm not saying this is true for any of you, but we sort of have culturally this story that like people with substance use disorders just like love to feel good. They love to feel good so much that they destroy their entire lives and they destroy the lives of everyone around them. And we want to replace that story. Old stories say like addiction is a moral failing, right? It's a spiritual um God, what was the old ASAM language? The old definition of addiction per ASAM said it I can't remember what they said, but they said it was essentially like a spiritual lack. Somehow people were lacking in spiritual something. I don't remember. Probably some of you guys know it. Um, and when I think about that, I think, okay, well, we now know that that's not true. We know that like addiction's not a moral failing. Everyone in this room understands that. And yet we haven't always been good about creating a story that fits there. And so I want to give you guys some of the neurobiology because I want to help replace that story. Yeah, and Jake says we can assume every client has some trauma in their history. It can be triggered easily unless providers are sensitive and aware of this. And yeah, I love that so much. That is the essence of trauma informed care. We know that people that come into our services have experienced a lot of trauma and adversity, and we're going to change our services to tend to that. And in order to change our services on a really, really deep level, we have to change the story we're telling about the people that walk through the door. And when I say story, I don't actually mean that like you guys have got books throughout your treatment centers that tell the story of how addiction happens. You guys know what I mean, right? Like these kind of invisible cultural narratives about who people are and why they're that way. Okay, so in the retelling of the
Lydia,
story,
Joellen also wrote, if you know why, it's easier to address that issue. Just wanted to highlight that too.
oh, awesome. Well, gosh, why don't I see that? Yeah, if you
It's
know,
a direct one to me, I think.
oh, got it. Yeah, if you know the why, then it's easier to address the issue, right? If you know why something happened, then you can tackle that and prevent it from continuing or um, prevent it from happening again. So let's start at sort of the beginning of where this neurobiological data comes from, because I want you guys to have a full story of how we got to where we are. So, gosh, it's 20 or 30 years ago now. A study came out that said children who experience trauma, and it was specifically men with a certain number of ACEs, which we'll come back to in a second, um, are 46 times more likely to develop a substance use disorder as an adult, which is totally every time I see that number, I'm just blown away. That's not a number you see in public health. That's not a number we see in healthcare on a regular basis. And it's such a big number that it's not just correlation. We can really say, okay, this is big enough that we understand this to be causative. And in fact, in part because of this study, ASAM changed their definition. They took out some of the language around spiritual depravity and said, instead, we think this has to do with life experiences. So the American Society of Addiction Medicine changed the way that they defined addiction because of some of this data, saying, okay, we understand that this is about adversity and life experiences. All right, next slide. And that study, as some of you guys are probably familiar with, was some of the early ACEs work. Um, and who can tell us a tiny little bit about the ACEs study?
Just like that, children with a certain amount of ACEs were a lot more likely to develop health issues, die at a younger age, develop substance use disorders, mental health disorders, all those types of things.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So ACEs looked at adverse childhood experiences. The primary investigator was this guy, Felitti. It was late 1990s, and he was a Kaiser researcher and clinician. And it's really fascinating because he was actually an obesity researcher. And what he found is that people could lose weight, but then they often didn't keep weight off. And so he started to do these qualitative interviews with people, trying to understand why they couldn't keep the weight off. I think that this is fascinating because now we know that caloric restriction dieting is always going to come back. It just always is. Caloric restriction dieting just doesn't really work for people. It's always going to come back. But at the time we didn't know that. That wasn't something that we knew in healthcare. And so he did these like deep dive qualitative interviews, like, what's up with this? Why do you gain the weight back? And what he uncovered was really surprising to him, although it probably feels really intuitive for most of us that do addiction work. He uncovered that people had had these really, really hard childhoods. And he sort of pulled out 9 or 10 key themes. And then he did this big, very large populations based study at Kaiser, where he asked people what had happened to them in childhood, 9 experiences of adversity or trauma or experiencing chaos. And then he linked that. So he asked adults, and then he linked that with health outcomes in adulthood. Health outcomes like major depression, like psychosis. We often forget about that when we're talking ACEs. He linked what had happened to you in childhood with adult health outcomes. And he found that over and over and over again, and almost regardless of what the condition was, health outcomes were poorer. So major depression, suicide attempts and suicide completion, psychotic experiences, diabetes, chronic pain, and then stuff that wasn't about behavioral health kind of traditionally at all, like autoimmune disorders. And so initially, when we had this data, and we can go to the next slide. Initially, when we had this data, it was like, oh, well, people are self-treating. So a lot of the early sort of discussion about ACEs is, well, yeah, of course, people experience hardship in childhood, and then they're going to sort of self-treat that pain with various behaviors in adulthood. So, for example, alcohol use disorder was correlated with high ACEs scores. So you can see this graph right here is showing how many ACEs scores and then the likelihood of developing an alcohol use disorder in adulthood. Next slide. And IV drug use and ACEs. And again, you just see that there's this like direct correlation. The more ACEs you have, the higher, the more likely it is you're going to develop IV drug use in adulthood. And it looked like that over and over again. But in these early days, really the conversations were, okay, people are sort of self-treating their pain. Next slide. Next slide. That one's about suicide. And then researchers said, okay, well, this is really interesting because we can kind of psychologically understand the idea of self treating pain. But what about when people have things like lupus, and which is an autoimmune disorder? What about when people have an autoimmune disorder? How do we understand that as being connected to adverse childhood experiences? How do we make sense of the fact that adverse childhood experiences don't just change our behavior in adulthood, but seem to really impact actually the way our bodies are functioning? So it's not just making us more likely to want to drink, it's actually changing our blood sugar levels as we move into adulthood, and it's changing our immune system. So, what is up with that? And so you'll see here, this comes from SAMHSA, and it's essentially saying, okay, we've got all this ACEs data. We know that adverse childhood experiences impact social, emotional, and cognitive impairment, but we're not really sure how that happens. And then we're not really sure how adoption of health risk behaviors starts. And then we're definitely not sure how that really increases early death and other poor health outcomes that aren't about health behaviors. We don't really understand this. Next slide. And a bunch of other folks came along. And by the way, guys, I'm going through this super quickly for the sake of today. Some of this stuff I love to sort of explore for hours at a time because I think it's so important. And this next slide is one of those where I'm like, oh, this probably actually deserves 3 hours, but let's just tackle it pretty quickly for today. Some other folks came along and said, hey, there's something else going on here that is being ignored in this data. So this population study comes from Kaiser before Medicaid expansion. So who was the population that was studied?
Like WASPs, like white people.
Yeah, I mean, I think interestingly enough, I think it was actually pretty racially diverse. I'd have to go back and look at the data. It was pretty racially diverse, but it also meant that it was people that had access to healthcare. And access to healthcare often means connection to stable employment, or family has connection to stable employment, and you're well connected enough to family that you've got private health insurance. And overwhelmingly, even though it was pretty racially diverse, it wasn't very class diverse at all. And so what people started to think about was, hey, like, is this really showing, is this showing the diversity of population that we want to see? And also, are adverse childhood experiences more likely to happen and create poor health outcomes in communities of color, in poorer communities and more marginalized communities? And did we miss some protective stuff in, for example, communities of color? Did we miss some protective things in poorer communities that might protect people from developing these health risk behaviors or developing things like autoimmune disorders? So the idea here was to really look at these structures and say, hey, ACEs might have missed some stuff. And specifically, Indigenous folks have said, hey, ACEs got a lot of stuff wrong because we're carrying this burden of historical trauma. And researchers like Joy DeGrier Leary, who is a Black woman, she's actually based in Portland. I've never met her, but she lives in the same city that I do. She wrote this book called Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. And so the idea here was really thinking about what sort of these bigger systems of sort of structural violence systems did to change people's neurobiology and how much of that was missed in the early ACEs work. And so I just want to highlight that here because I'm relying a lot on ACEs data. And I want you guys to know that it has been sort of problematized and is something that we should always be talking about. Okay, what does this story miss? The story that I'm telling you guys of the neurobiology, what are all the things that are missing from this story? All right, so next slide. Next slide again. So let's talk about what the more recent evidence says about experiencing those adverse events in childhood and how that sets us up to develop substance use disorders in adulthood. And I've pulled out 3 that I think are the most salient and sort of the most interesting. And the one that I'm going to dive into the most is this first one here, just because it's the most complicated and tricky. And I don't want you guys to get too caught up in the neurobiology. Like if you try to really understand the neurobiology of this, I think for some of you nurses, it's going to make total sense. And if you're a peer or an alcohol and drug counselor or an administrator, you're going to be like, what did you just say? And don't think about the neurobiology of it. Just think about it conceptually. Just try to take the like broad conceptual strokes I'm saying and try to see if you can understand that. Okay. So this conceptual framework came out in 2015, and it's Nuslock and Miller. And you can just Google that, Nuslock and Miller. And it's a conceptual framework for understanding how adverse childhood experiences and really traumatic experiences overall, but they're relying a lot on the ACEs data, change our immune systems and make us, because of immune system dysregulation, make us more vulnerable to developing a substance use disorder. Isn't that bonkers? How many of you guys have thought about changes to the immune system as part of why people become dependent and addicted to substances?
Definitely only thought about it the other way around, like our immune system is affected by our substance use, but I never thought about like it being flipped.
Totally. It's such a weird thing to think about. And yet, I also think that almost all of you know this to a certain extent. I want you to think about this kind of intuitively. How many of you have had something really, really stressful that was going to happen or that you were waiting for or prepping for or really stressful happen, and it was a surprise, and then that thing is over and you finally get a chance to rest and you get sick? Any of you guys ever had that experience? The like classic ones, although I think they leave some people out of the story, the classic ones are like, you get married and then you go on your honeymoon and you get the worst cold of your life. Or you've got, what are those things called at the end of a school term? Finals. You've got finals. And then finals are over and you've got spring break and all of a sudden you have the stomach flu. How many of you have had COVID? A chunk of you, looks like. How many of you felt like your mood was impacted by that COVID? Oh yeah, Ken says, caught a nice stomach flu on my honeymoon. Word. Yep. Classic. Classic, Ken. And I saw at least one hand raise and maybe more for, yeah, COVID impacted my mood. So for me, the 3 months after I had COVID, I kind of went pretty bonkers. I've never been so anxious in my entire life. I am not an anxious person. I am a dysthymic person. I'm a little bit miserable all the time, but I'm not anxious. And for the 3 months after I had COVID, I was so anxious. I think the doctors thought that I was benzo seeking. I was like, "My heart is palpitating. I can't stop thinking about this and that. I'm so worried about this. Please give me Ativan." And they all looked at my chart and they were like, "History of alcohol use disorder. You can't have Ativan." Right? That's how anxious I was. So almost all of you recognize that there is a correlation between your immune response and your stress levels or your moods, right? So even though this sounds super new, where I'm going to say, oh, this changed your immune system, most of you know this on some level. Danielle said, yep, happened to me. I got married. We rushed building a shop for the 3 months before, and after it was done, I ended up getting a terrible cold, forced me to relax. Classic. Super stressed out, all this stuff going on, and then all of a sudden you finally got time to relax and your immune system goes into overdrive and you get a cold. And Desiree said, oh God, it just jumped around. Desiree said, our body keeps the score and definitely will slow us down when we don't do it ourselves. Absolutely. And our body keeps the score often in our immune system, bizarrely enough. So if you've read Our Body Keeps the Score, Bessel van der Kolk actually talks a lot about the immune system. I need to go back and read it again. But if you sort of dive in, a lot of what he's talking about is immune system stuff. And Angela said, every time I get a new job, I get sick in the second week, 100%. Yeah, I had a sore throat last night. I've had my new job for, oh my gosh, I've had my new job for like exactly 3 weeks. And yeah, last night I was like, ooh, my immune system feels kind of weak. Like I feel fine today, but last night I really felt like just kind of like run down and gross. So what the research has said, and again, this is going to sound really complicated, but I just want you to take the concepts of it. Ken said, I haven't read Bessel in a while. Look at it again. 100%. It goes into such good detail about immune system changes that happen from trauma and the way that our neurobiology shifts. So here's what we know. Trauma actually makes us more inflamed, and inflammation is an immune system response. And especially when we experience trauma in childhood, because our neurobiology is developing. So especially when we experience trauma, adversity, a lot of chaotic things happen, etc., that changes the baseline of our immune system in adulthood and makes us more globally inflamed. And when I say globally inflamed, I know that sounds really confusing, but what I mean is that we're going to heal more slowly from small things, and we're going to have more big inflammatory concerns. And what illnesses that you guys know of are inflammation related? Big illnesses.
And the lupus.
Yeah, things like lupus. That's an autoimmune disorder. It's about a shift in your immune system. Other things that are inflammatory are heart disease, diabetes, depression, neuropathy. Oh yeah, someone said heart disease. Absolutely, heart disease, certain types of arthritis. Christina said, I have a lot of clients with lupus. Absolutely. Ken said neuropathy, some types of neuropathy. Absolutely. Angela said fibromyalgia. Yeah, fibromyalgia is a weird one. It's definitely connected to ACEs. It is not necessarily inflammatory, but definitely connected to ACEs and probably has something to do with immune system dysregulation. Food allergies. Absolutely. Absolutely. Totally. Sorry, I just have to keep scrolling down. Asthma is an inflammatory illness. Absolutely. Some types of asthma, I should say, inflammatory illness. So Trauma changes our immune system, makes us more globally inflamed, which is going to make us have all of these inflammatory illnesses more regularly. So when clients show up, especially as they age, you're going to see in your populations, you're going to see a lot more heart disease, a lot more depression, a lot more diabetes, a lot more of those inflammatory illnesses. And one of the things that inflammation does is it dysregulates dopamine in the part of our brain that's responsible for learning and memory. And what does dopamine do? You guys, I'm having too much fun talking about this and I'm going over time. Sorry,
Makes
say
you
that again.
feel good.
Yeah, someone said dopamine makes you feel good. Someone said it increases mood, makes us feel happy. Yeah, so makes us feel good, increases mood, makes us feel happy. And I'm actually going to push back on that because you guys are right. That's the story we have about dopamine, but I'm going to push back on that just a little tiny bit, which is from an evolutionary perspective, evolution doesn't care how we feel. Evolution wants us to survive and procreate. So dopamine is there for us to remember something, remember that's important, and remember how to get it. And so our brain experiences it as pleasurable because we need to, oh, that thing's good. Remember where it is. I'm going to remember how to get it, and I'm going to want to go back and get more of it. So dopamine's really all about survival. Try, if you can, to unlearn the narrative that dopamine is about pleasure. Evolution does not care about pleasure. Evolution wants you to survive. So it's going to tell you these things are pleasurable because they help you survive. And if we think sort of ancestrally about this, stuff that was dopaminergic helped us to survive. It was like high fatty foods and sweet, high caloric content stuff, nuts, salmon, berries, and then we can't forget sex. Sex is wildly dopaminergic. Well, I guess I should say orgasms are dopaminergic. They look kind of like heroin if you look at how much they impact our dopamine. Orgasms, it's not so much that we just have this thing that feels really good, but that was there because of survival, right? Procreation. Okay, so the long story short here is that trauma changes our immune system and makes us find those dopaminergic things even more powerful. So the big conceptual piece here, trauma changes the immune system. That immune system shift makes it so that those dopaminergic things, those quote unquote pleasurable things that are about our survival, feel that much more important. So someone goes to a party and there is ice cream at the party, let's say, just as an example, and that person has an ACEs score of 8 and they eat a bowl of ice cream and they feel like they want 3 more bowls of ice cream because that salient experience, that dopaminergic experience was just so big. And the other person that has 1 ACEs score has 1 bowl of ice cream and feels satiated. And it's because of a change in your immune system. And if you want to dive into this, I just gave you like the sort of broadest conceptual strokes that I could in a really brief period of time. If you want to understand this more, look up that Nuslock and Miller 2015 study. It is a beast. I have probably read it 30 times and I still am like, do I really understand this? I think I mostly get it at this point, but definitely dive in because it's pretty interesting. And it really changes like what we, will we be sent this? I'd like to give it to some people. I think that's maybe about a recording of this, but I can absolutely send out also the Nuslock and Miller. We can send that out if people are interested in it.
Or if you're okay with me sharing the slides, Lydia.
Totally, absolutely.
Then I can send that.
I also wrote a paper on trauma-informed care for substance use disorders, and literally everything that I'm telling you guys today is in that paper, and I will send you a link to it today. So if you're like, wait, what was that study? Oh, Nuslock and Miller. Cool. That's in my references in the paper. All right. So quick overview of that. Again, it sounds really overwhelming. Just remember, trauma changes your immune system. And that makes you more vulnerable to experiencing a lot of power and impact from those dopaminergic substances. The other thing that happens with trauma is that we tend to get less executive function. So we get less control in our prefrontal cortex. So those things that help to organize our brain and help us to reflect on our emotions and act in accordance with our values, we get less of that when we experience trauma and adversity. And a lot of people find that they need substances to regulate emotions. And you'll see that with your clients all the time, whether it's good emotions or really hard emotions. The amount of evidence between stress levels and cortisol going up and a return to use is really, really big and overwhelming. Or cortisol levels going up because something good happens. Cortisol levels go up, and all of a sudden you need a substance to regulate some of those feelings. And I'm going to skip the third one just for the sake of time, but it'll be on the slides. So next slide. This gets us to where I want to start. Sorry, that was a pretty abrupt shift. That is a quick and dirty overview of the neurobiology of how trauma and adversity shifts things in our bodies and makes us more susceptible to developing a substance use disorder. And that hopefully helps us to sort of recreate the narrative we have about who people are with substance use disorders and how they came to be that way. And the reason that that is so important is because if we want to do trauma-informed care, which is where we're going to pick up next time I see you all, which is in 2 weeks, I think. That's so important to change our narrative because then we can do the key pieces of trauma-informed care like collaboration. So if you think someone's got a moral illness that's a spiritual depravity and that if they just try harder, they can stop using substances, you're not going to be as able to truly collaborate with them. But if the story you have is, holy smokes, this person has experienced a lot of trauma, a lot of adversity, and their neurobiology is shifted and they're really sort of susceptible to developing a substance use disorder, gosh, I'm going to see if I can collaborate with them on their treatment plan. You're going to be able to do trauma-informed care better. So you have to replace one story with another in order to do the thing. So that's where we will end today, and we'll pick up next time I see you. So again, we've sort of chunked it out. We talk about stigma because it gets in the way. And then we talk about those stigmatized narratives and how to replace them with a neurobiologically based narrative of how people develop addiction. And gosh, it felt real rushed. But hopefully you got something out of that. And then we'll start next time with actually what trauma-informed care looks like when you implement it into a substance use disorder treatment program, whatever that program is. What questions do you guys have for me?
Now I will stop sharing and I'm sorry. Yes, stop sharing and stop recording so that we can
Oh, great.
conversation.
Will we receive an email invitation for the next one? And then will we also receive the email for